Destiny of a Savior by Famous Fault. Chapter 8, Underneath the Dark Mark. The coin felt hot as it changed. Tracy removed it from her pocket and looked startled at it. The only reason she was still carrying it around was because it had become a habit during the previous year, and since she had a suspicion that if the Hermione would ever need help, she'd use the enchanted coins. She had been sitting in the library doing homework, nothing special. It was nearing the time where she would have to get going in order to make it to the room of requirement before Filch started to scurry around the castle in order to make sure no students were out of bed. The date the coin showed, and the time for that matter, were those of the here and now. She frowned at it but understood what it meant. They needed to get there at once. She quickly gathered her stuff and dashed for the room of requirement. That was, after all, where they used to gather. She had not even reached the corridor of the room of requirement when she heard footsteps behind her. With just a glance, she determined that it was Neville. Knowing that he too had answered the call, she kept running. He was friend, not foe. She hated having to do that, dividing people between friends and foes, but that was the only way to survive at the moment. Hermione, Ron, Ginny, and Luna were already there when Neville and Tracy joined them. "What's going on?" she asked when she came to a halt. "There is a possibility Death Eaters will enter the castle tonight," Hermione said with a grim expression. "Both Dumbledore and Harry have left the castle, so we'll have to do something about it. There are other people here too, but Dumbledore's orders. But the Death Eaters will be prepared for them, not for us." "I see," Tracy whispered and dropped her books in a corner and conjured her wand. "Then we'd better get ready for them." Surely Tracy had a whole lot more questions, but she understood that most of those could not be answered. "Do you think any more will come?" Neville asked and looked around, troubled at their low number. "I don't think many still carry around their coin," Ginny said, and shook her head. "Most likely not." "Luna and I will check on Snape's office," Hermione said, not looking entirely comfortable with that. Tracy looked up startled. "Why?" "That takes too much time to explain," Hermione said and made an attempt to leave, but Tracy grabbed the brunette's arm. "At least, Luna, can we switch places?" Tracy looked at Luna, pleading. "Oh, yeah, sure," Luna said, sounding as dreamy as ever. "Come on," Hermione said, pulling out of Tracy's grip a bit troubled, nearly suspicious. The two girls started to run, Tracy leading the way since she was more familiar with the dungeons than Hermione was. In addition to that, Tracy was faster and more agile, which gave her quite an advantage. Before they were even halfway towards Snape's office, they heard the first bang coming from above them. Tracy cursed under her breath. Did the castle really have to be that big? The bang made that Hermione stopped to look around alarmed. "Keep running!" Tracy called out, urging Hermione on. Both of them were getting tired at a rapid pace and not a little bit afraid for the fate of their friends. When they reached Snape's office, they found Professor Flitwick unconscious with Snape bent over him. "He fainted," Snape said when he saw the two girls. "Take care of him." Without another word, he dashed past them. Hermione hurried towards Professor Flitwick, while Tracy stood in the doorway, doubtful as to what to do. Then she made a rash decision. "I'm going after them." Hermione just nodded. Tracy set off after Snape, following his footsteps, while she herself for once was glad that she was a werewolf, allowing her to move completely silent, even when running. In compare to her, Snape was both loud and slow, and Tracy had no problem following him whatsoever. When they arrived at the upper corridors, Tracy noticed the dueling people. She recognized some from the Ministry of Magic, others from A Christmas at the Weasleys. Lupin, Bill, and several others. Ginny and Neville were dancing away from the spells which were being cast around at random. She also caught a glimpse of McGonagall. Snape, however, did not care about any of it, somewhat to Tracy's surprise, and just ran past the fight. No one even noticed him. Luckily for her, no one noticed her either. Snape headed to the astronomy tower, and with a wave of his wand and a forceful incantation, blasted something that obviously was a barrier of some sort. He ran up the stairs, still unaware of being followed. Tracy felt worse and worse about it all. She knew her relation with Snape was rather unique, and she had always deemed him trustworthy, although his motives could be odd at times. He had helped her save a Tem, after all. She disliked herself for distrusting him, but something was telling her she had to. Then something rumbled. It was silent and without movement, yet Tracy covered her ears and felt her knees under the weight of it. Just a look up the stairs made clear that Snape had noticed it too. He was still standing, but he was clearly weighed down. Something in the castle had started moving. Something Tracy knew would make the difference between winning and losing, depending on what side it would be on. She had honestly no idea what it was, and that troubled her. If the Death Eaters did know, then it wouldn't mean anything good for her and her friends. She had just time to dash out of sight before Snape looked down the stairs. When she heard his footsteps again, she dared looking up and saw that he wasn't looking her way anymore. She set off after him. Tracy caught up with him just as he reached the door giving access to the astronomy tower. He blasted it open with a reductor curse and walked in without sparing the stairs a glance. Tracy hid behind the door. She had only caught a glimpse of the situation, but she was wise enough to not simply run in there. 4 Death Eaters, Malfoy, and a wandless Dumbledore promised nothing good. She held her head bent and listened attentively. "We've got a problem, Snape," said a man's voice, one of the Death Eaters. "The boy doesn't seem able—" Tracy didn't even dare breathing as she heard the headmaster's voice.
"Severus,"
it pleaded. Then there was silence for about 3 seconds.
"Severus, please."
"Avada Kedavra," a horribly familiar voice said, and Tracy needed all her self-control not to scream. She didn't need to see the scene to know who had been hit by the spell. She pushed herself as hard against the wall as she could. "Out of here, quickly," Snape said, and Tracy had barely time to make sure she was completely hidden by the door. There was no chance she'd survive the 5 of them. Draco and Snape passed her first, not paying any attention to their surroundings. Tracy still couldn't believe that the man who had helped her when she had been under fire by all of the school turned out to be one of Voldemort's minions. Perhaps his aim had been the same as that of the werewolf which had approached her during Christmas. Snape was followed by a man with grey hair and bestial appearance. He looked vicious. Then 2 people who, without a doubt, were brother and sister passed her. Not one of them even glanced towards her hiding spot. She knew 1 more Death Eater was supposed to pass her before the tower would be deserted. That's why she jumped when she heard a "Petrificus Totalis" from a familiar voice, and the Death Eater in the doorway fell. Tracy had hardly time to react before Harry jumped over the Death Eater. She did not question it. She just ran after the clearly furious Gryffindor. She herself still needed some time to become furious. She had not comprehended the situation fully yet. When Tracy reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw the bestial man bowed over Harry. There was something over the Death Eater's stance she recognized. His behavior was familiar. No one else would have recognized it just from his position, but Tracy recognized him as a werewolf just a second before his smell betrayed him. A werewolf about to rip Harry's throat. She charged for him like a wolf would have. She didn't even consider stunning him. She hit into his side full force, rocketing the both of them off the Gryffindor, who quickly crawled to his feet. Tracy and the werewolf rolled over the ground a fair bit before either of them was able to get up again. The werewolf growled at her, ready to attack her blindly, but his nose caught up with his claws. He stopped before he could launch himself at her. "Oh, werewolf," he said with a raw voice and laughed. "You should be on my side." "Look, hell!" Tracy called out and gripped her wand. She was slightly shocked at how easy she had given in to her more bestial instincts, but now she'd fight as a witch. "I'll rip your throat out," he promised before jumping at her. "Stupefy!" she called out and hit the werewolf full in the chest. He slid over the ground and came to a halt against rubble from the ceiling, which had partially collapsed. She turned around to find that the hall was empty of Death Eaters. The fight was over. They had achieved their goal and were fleeing. She looked around. No Harry. He must have gone after them. The castle was moving. Students had awoken and were probably heading out to the grounds to find out what had happened. After all, they had probably seen either the Death Eaters or Harry pass by, heading towards the entrance hall. She saw Ginny leaving. She was probably heading toward the grounds too. "Nice work, Miss Davis," McGonagall said, and came to stand next to Tracy as she looked upon the fallen werewolf. "There is a Death Eater on the stairs too," Tracy said. "Harry hit him with a full buddy bind curse." Lupin and a woman who Tracy recognized from the Ministry of Magic ran up the stairs. They returned after just a couple of seconds. "He'll be out for a while," Lupin said. "He's no threat to us." It was obvious that neither Lupin nor the woman had looked down. No one here knew about Dumbledore yet. Is everyone still alive?" Tracy asked McGonagall. She had already lost Rebecca last time. Having lost anyone else was not something she wanted to deal with. She got sight of Neville. Luna was next to him. He's alive," Luna assured her. "He was awake just a second ago, but he fainted." "We need to get them to the hospital wing," Lupin said firmly. "Bill too." "Professor?" Tracy said, turning to the deputy headmistress, something shooting to mind. "Professor Flitwick is hurt too. Last time I saw him, Hermione was with him. They're in Snape's office." "I'll go check on him," McGonagall said with a soft smile and then hurried off, clearly worried about her colleague. The woman and Luna lifted Neville by each putting an arm around their shoulders. Like that, they hoisted Neville between them. He looked ghostly pale. Lupin and Ron attended to Ron's older brother, Bill, if she remembered correctly. That left her with little else to do but just follow. In silence, they moved towards the hospital wing. Tracy didn't spare the dead Death Eater on the floor even a glance. He was insignificant. They were halfway there when they were joined by Rebecca. "What happened?" the ghost asked. It was only the fourth time, the opening speech not included, since Rebecca had died that Tracy had seen her, and it was still painful to see the pale and transparent version of her friend. "The school was attacked. It's over now, though," Tracy said gloomy. The people in front of her still did not know about Dumbledore, and truth be told, Tracy didn't want to tell them. "I see," Rebecca said, and thought deeply for a while. "I have to go." Without even waiting for an answer, she flew off. Madame Pomfrey hurried towards them when they arrived. She showed them the way, and they put Bill and Neville on a bed each. Madame Pomfrey did a quick search of Neville, and soon came to the conclusion that he would make a full recovery, even though it would take some time. It was a relief, but the relief wasn't complete. It was the unrecognizable face of Bill which caused a fair bit of worry. Madame Pomfrey rolled up her sleeves and looked at Bill for a while. Then she conjured her wand and tried a variety of spells. Not one of them worked.
It's no use,
Lupin said.
They're from a werewolf.
I see, Madame Pomfrey said in much the same tone as Rebecca had used. Then Hermione entered together with McGonagall and a still unconscious Professor Flitwick. Madame Pomfrey left Bill for a second to check on Professor Flitwick. He too would need some rest, but would also be fine. As soon as McGonagall had Professor Flitwick's well-being confirmed, she hurried off to attend to different matters. Then she returned to Bill and conjured a green ointment and started dabbing his wounds with it. The smell was horrible, but none of them moved away from the bed. They were all standing around it with troubled expressions. Then again, the door to the hospital wing opened and in came Ginny, followed by Harry. Everyone present looked up. Hermione reacted first and ran up to Harry and gave him a tight hug. Are you okay? I'm fine, he assured her, though in Tracy's opinion he looked far from fine. The death of Dumbledore had shaken him even more than it had shaken her. Hermione asked Ginny the same question, who also lowly assured everyone she was fine. How's Bill? Harry asked, and Ginny hurried to her brother's side. Harry looked over Hermione's shoulder at Madame Pomfrey. Isn't there something else you could do? I've tried everything I know, Madame Pomfrey answered, her voice indicating she was disappointed with herself. There was no cure for werewolf bites. For once she was not complaining about there being too many visitors, something which proved the gravity of the situation. But he wasn't bitten at the full moon, Ron said. Greyback hadn't transformed, so surely Bill won't be a real... He looked first at Tracy, then at Lupin. So that was Greyback, the werewolf who contaminated her. Tracy suddenly found herself wishing she had done more damage to him than she had. Then she shrugged to answer Ron's question. She had absolutely no idea. No, I don't think that Bill will be a true werewolf, Lupin said. But that does not mean that there won't be some contamination. Those are cursed wounds. They are unlikely ever to heal fully, and Bill might have some wolfish characteristics from now on. Dumbledore might know something that'd work, though, Ron said. Where is he? Bill fought those maniacs on Dumbledore's orders. Dumbledore owes him. He can't leave him in this state. I'm very sorry, Mr. Weasley. An accented voice spoke from behind them. Once again, all looked up to see Professor Marcheshon walk in through the still open doors. Dumbledore is dead, but perhaps I can offer my help as far as it can go. No! Lupin said, horrified, and looked around him. Harry and Ginny just nodded. Tracy didn't react on any of it. Lupin collapsed on a chair next to Bill's bed. How did he die? The woman asked. How did it happen? Snape killed him, Harry said. I was there. I saw it. We arrived back on the astronomy tower because that's where the mark was. Dumbledore was ill. He was weak. But I think he realized it was a trap when we heard footsteps running up the stairs. He immobilized me. I couldn't do anything. I was under the invisibility cloak. And then Malfoy came through the door and disarmed him. Hermione clapped her hands to her mouth and Ron groaned. Luna's mouth trembled. More Death Eaters arrived. Then Snape. And Snape did it. The Avada Kedavra. Harry couldn't go on. It's true, Tracy confirmed. I was there too. For a second she thought that Harry would be angry with her for not doing anything, but his expression didn't change from sorrow. Madame Pomfrey burst into tears, and Tracy caught the glimpse of distaste on Professor Marcheson's face before it vanished. He walked forward and led the matron away from Bill and sat her down in a chair where she continued sobbing. Listen, Ginny whispered, and from outside she heard a beautiful sound. But if anyone would have asked her, Tracy would have claimed it came from inside her. It was a phoenix, she realized. Somehow the phoenix's song eased all their pain a little bit. It was Professor Marcheson who broke the silence. I can heal his wounds, but not stop the contamination. Ron just looked at the professor with a look on his face Harry had never seen before. Please, was the only reply he received. Professor Marcheson conjured a high chair out of seemingly thin air and put it down next to the bed. He sat down and stared at Bill, his blue-gray eyes intense, almost inhumane. Then, after a minute or so, he put a hand on Bill's face. He closed his eyes and scowled before removing his hand again. He repeated the gesture a couple of times. Tracy did not understand what he was doing, but she did not question any of it. Then McGonagall walked in again. It was first now that Tracy noticed that Professor McGonagall bore marks from combat. Her face was scratched and her robes torn. Her hair, however, was impressively enough still in a tight bun. Molly and Arthur are on their way, she said, taking no notice of Professor Marcheson. Harry, what happened? According to Hagrid, you were with Professor Dumbledore when it happened. He says Professor Snape was involved in some... Snape killed Dumbledore, Harry said. Tracy, who was the person among them who knew Dumbledore least, did only half follow the conversation that followed. Questions. How had Snape convinced Dumbledore? How had the Death Eaters entered the castle? What happened during the battle? Then Tracy came to think of something. Wait a second. Did any of you feel a weight? Like a silent rumble pushing you down? Everyone exchanged glances. The woman whose name Tracy still didn't know nodded. Yes, I did. Several others nodded too. I wonder what it was, McGonagall whispered. The Death Eater firing spells all around him, Ginny mused, rubbing her chin. He did not hit anyone. I didn't think about it at all when it happened, but it was as if his spells vanished before they hit anything. I just saw a streak of white close to the ground. Me too, Ron called out. A streak of white catching spells. I did not see what it was, though. Madame Pomfrey, Professor Marcheson suddenly said, interrupting their musings. Can you help me? The matron stood up and wobbled her way towards the foreigner who was taking care of Bill. Yes, try healing him again. It should work now, Professor Marcheson said. But there is no cure for werewolf bites. Professor Marcheson looked at her without expression. Officially, these bites don't count as werewolf bites anymore. I can't get it out of his blood, but I could get it out of his wounds. Then he stood up and the chair vanished. It took Madame Pomfrey less than a minute to cure Bill's face. There weren't even any scars left. So, simply put, Luna said, speaking for the first time, something saved our butts. Rather nice of them. Tracy saw a vague smile pass over some faces present, even Harry's. Luna would be Luna. Then Mr. and Mrs. Weasley burst in, closely followed by Fleur de Coeur. The three all looked terrified. McGonagall stood up and hurried towards them. Lupin, the woman, Professor Marcheson, and Tracy hastily moved away to make place at the bed for the three newcomers. Bill! Miss Weasley called out and ran past McGonagall towards her son. Mr. Weasley came to stand next to his wife, who clearly had not noticed yet that Bill looked rather healthy for someone who had been attacked by a werewolf. I thought... Mr. Weasley started with a frown. You said he had been attacked by Greyback. It was, Lupin confirmed. Professor Marcheson was able to heal him, but there will be contamination, Arthur. He will not become like me or Miss Davis, since there was no full moon. But he will be different.
We just can't tell how different. And Dumbledore? Is it true, Minerva?
The red-haired man asked. McGonagall just nodded.
And what happened to Greyback?
Mr. Weasley continued. His anger and hatred were impossible to miss.
Tracy blasted him against a pile of rubble. He should still be there,
Lupin said and smiled at Tracy. She accepted the well-hidden compliment with a shy blush.
Thank you. We owe you,
Mr. Weasley said and took one of her hands. His eyes were burning with a fire that proved that Fred and George were more like their parents than many thought. Now you do not, Tracy said.
I've got to thank you, though, Harry said. You saved my life up there. Had it not been for you, Greyback would have ripped my throat.
Tracy just nodded, knowing it was no use protesting. Miss Weasley took little notice of any of them. She just caressed Bill's cheek and looked up at Professor Marcheshon. Thank you. My pleasure, the stern teacher said with a genuine tone before walking away with his creamy white cloak sweeping around him. Most people looked after him. They all were uncertain about where the teacher stood. At one hand, he had saved Katie Bill's life and had now helped Bill. At the other hand, he had not been present at the battle. He was a source of wonder. Then he turned just before reaching the door. I'm sorry I wasn't able to do more. Then he finally walked out, closing the doors behind him. The fact that no one knew what Bill would be like made them all a bit gloomy. Then Fleur spoke. I don't care. It does not matter what he will be like when he wakes up. I'll still love him just as much. Tracy smiled. Just spending one Christmas in the Burrow had been enough for her to learn what Miss Weasley thought about Fleur, but Tracy herself wasn't sure if Fleur was completely shallow. Surely the Goblet of Fire would not have chosen her had she been only shallow. Then, before their very eyes, scars appeared on Bill's face. They were not as obvious as they would have been had they healed naturally, but it was more than obvious what had happened to him. The scars mutilated his face in a way that would make him rather scary to someone who did not know him. I suppose Professor Marcheshon wasn't completely able to remove the contamination from the wounds, Madame Pomfrey said, something pleased in her voice. Tracy frowned. Adults could really be childish.
That would have surprised me,
Lupin said with a deep sigh. And he was such a handsome boy. He was even going to be married. Not that it matters to me how he looks, Miss Weasley said. Poor boy. You think I will not wish to marry him? Or perhaps you up? Fleur asked, her nostrils flaring. What do I care how he looks? I am good looking enough for both of us, I think. All this goes to show is that my husband is brave, and I shall do that, she added fiercely. Not just a little childish, either. Tracy smiled and sighed. She was just curious as to how Mrs. Weasley would react on that. And Bill, if you ever found out. Hermione was also shaking her head with a puzzled look on her face. Harry, Ron, and Ginny were waiting for Miss Weasley's reaction, not one of them even daring to move. It didn't exactly come the way any of them had expected. Our great-aunt Muriel, Miss Weasley said after a long pause, has a very beautiful tiara, goblin-made, which I am sure I could persuade her to lend you for the wedding. She is very fond of Bill, you know, and it would look lovely with your hair. Thank you, said Fleur stiffly. I am sure that would be lovely. Then before any of them could react, Mrs. Weasley and Fleur hugged each other, both crying of relief and perhaps gratefulness. Fleur had proved that she truly loved Bill, and in the end, that was what mattered to Miss Weasley. Actually, it was like something from a movie, a poor one at that. You see, said his strained voice. The woman was glaring at Lupin. She still wants to marry him, even though he's been bitten. She doesn't care. It's different, Lupin said, barely moving his lips and looking suddenly tense. Bill will not be a full werewolf. The cases are completely... But I don't care either. I don't care. The still unnamed woman said, seizing the front of Lupin's robes and checking him. I've told you 1,000,000 times! But no one ever found out what she had told Lupin 1,000,000 times since the doors opened once again. Tracy! Someone called out and ran towards her and stopped just before crashing into her. It was Dean. Are you okay? Rebecca told me you were in the hospital wing. What happened? I'm fine, she said, calming, and patted the hand he had put on her shoulder. That was very nice of her.
Then Dean hugged her. The tight hug was evidence of how worried he had been. "You scared me." Then he let go and looked around. He was not bothered the least by the people around him. Instead, he looked at Bill with a frown, then at Neville and Professor Flitwick.
"They'll be fine too," Tracy answered before Dean could ask. "More or less. Were you on the grounds?"
Dean's jaw tightened.
"Yes. I helped Professor Sprout get the students back to bed. The whole school knows by now. Professor Slughorn would inform the ministry."
He put an arm around Tracy.
"You know what that means, don't you?"
he asked her. Tracy nodded. It had been present in the back of her head.
"Regardless of what happens now, we'll need to run."
"What do you mean?" McGonagall asked, horrified.
"It's true you're considering to close the school, right?"
Tracy asked, a tad straightforward.
"In that case, no Muggle-born will be safe at home, and I've upset the Werewolf Society by denying them. Death Eaters will start hunting us down. And if the school reopens, how large is the chance that it is under Voldemort's whims?"
Every person present went pale. Not one of them had thought that far.
"That counts for me, too,"
Hermione whispered.
"That counts for a lot of people in the school,"
Miss Weasley added.
"I can't let that happen to the school,"
McGonagall said, her eyes wide in horror, and she collapsed on a chair.
"It'd be horrible."
"Life of a fugitive," Dean said with a wry smile. "Not really what I expected when I received my letter."
"Ah,"
Tracy said and shrugged.
"It'll be fine. We don't have to do it alone."
Dean's grip on her tightened. "Are you going to come?" he asked, genuinely surprised.
"Well, naturally, through hell together,"
she said with a smile and rested her head against his shoulder.
"I've told you all along you're taking a ridiculous line on this, Remus,"
Miss Weasley said, looking over Fleur's shoulder at the werewolf. Dean looked at Tracy, not understanding the situation.
"What did I miss?"
he whispered so that only she heard.
"Just watch and listen," she whispered back. "I'm sure you'll understand."
"I'm not being ridiculous," Lupin said steadily. "Tonks deserves someone young and whole." Mr. Weasley smiled weakly. "But she wants you. And after all, Remus, young and whole men don't necessarily remain so." He gestured at Bill. Lupin opened his mouth to speak, but Dean beat him to the point. "Professor," he said with a frown, "it's true that it does not matter." "Exactly!" Fleur added quickly before turning back to Bill. "This is not the time to..." Lupin said.
"Might as well,"
Tracy said, interrupting him.
"Age is a number, and whole... that depends on point of view."
"I'm a beast!" Lupin growled.
"Greyback is a beast. You're like me, and I'm no beast,"
Tracy said, crossing her arms, almost insulted.
"Being a werewolf is only as bad as one makes it. Sure, there are a whole lot of people who hold great prejudice against us, but screw them. That only means we have to keep the people who don't care as close as we can, not push them away."
"I think you should mind your tongue, Remus," McGonagall said, sounding forlorn. "Remember that teenagers know everything." Tonks smiled gratefully at Tracy and Dean. Then she put a hand on Remus's shoulder. "They can live happily despite Tracy's condition, so why couldn't we? You have a human heart, that's all that matters." Tonks received no answer. When Hagrid walked in and started to receive instructions from Professor McGonagall, Tracy started to yawn. Contagious as it was, Dean quickly got on.
"Let's go catch some sleep,"
Tracy suggested. Dean nodded. "The room of requirement is not accessible," Ron said quickly. "It's been sealed off to await investigation."
"Then I'll go inform the Slytherins about what happened. I'm sure they're dying to know,"
Tracy said, yawning again. "But," Dean protested.
"If they are going to protest, I jinxed them,"
she promised Dean. Not only Dean and Tracy, but all of them left for their respective dormitories. Yet Tracy did not go there at once. She made a little detour, entering Snape's office. Surely the man had murdered Dumbledore and proved his allegiance with the Death Eaters. But something was still wrong with the scenario.
"What is it?"
she mused out loud, as she slowly made a round through his office.
"That we don't know?"
Usually, the owl was waiting on the roof for Yugi to come out before delivering the prophet. This time, however, the owl was sitting right outside the door, in plain sight. Rio would not be in today, but the owl had to be gone before the first customers arrived. Yugi hurried out, quickly removing the paper and handing the owl a nut. It flew away without drawing any attention. It had been a long time since any real news had appeared in the Daily Prophet. It was more as if the Daily Prophet was struggling to keep any news coming at all, whatever news. Yugi always scanned the list of people found dead, but had not seen any names he recognized yet, something which made him rather grateful. When he unrolled the paper that morning, he had not expected anything special. When he saw the front line, he winced, as if someone had hit him in the face. He stood there, frozen to the ground, looking at the face of Albus Dumbledore, with large black letters above it. Headmaster assassinated. Yugi wasn't stupid. He knew very well that without the headmaster, the school would be just as vulnerable as the rest of Britain. Truth be told, Yugi was surprised that the ministry had not fallen yet. He guessed it would not take long now anymore. When it did, however, the school would turn into hell. All these thoughts were swarming through the back of his head while his conscious self was staring at the paper in disbelief. Dumbledore could simply not be dead. It was not possible.
Yugi?
Atem asked, who had felt Yugi's shock. Yugi did not react, so Atem simply appeared beside him and read over the younger shoulder.
No!
The former king gasped as he saw the news. Yugi turned around, still staring at the paper, and walked back into the shop. He closed the door behind him and locked it as he turned the sign telling they were open so that it said closed. He walked towards the counter and sat down as he quickly started to read the article. Some parts interested him more than others, but things became clear pretty soon. Snape killed Dumbledore, Yugi whispered. In the end, that was all that mattered. Surely he registered the fact that Death Eaters had entered the school and the date of the funeral. But at the moment, they were irrelevant. He waited until he could hear his own words, then dropped the paper on the counter and suddenly got into a hurry. He closed the curtains covering the windows and ran up the stairs to his room. He conjured his trunk from underneath the bed and started packing it with high speed. He threw in whatever he imagined to be necessary. He frowned when he was done. The trip to Egypt had not been all too much fun. Nothing special had happened. They had just been there. Cole Elna looked still much the same from the way Pegasus had described it, and it was still a village of thieves and robbers. Perhaps they had hoped for something special to happen, but nothing had. The entire trip had felt like a disappointment. Rio probably wouldn't be all too happy at the thought of traveling abroad with Yugi again. It could, however, not be helped. Yugi double-checked the trunk and ran down the stairs to the telephone. There was a fair chance Rio was still asleep, but Yugi did not care. Standing there waiting for Rio to answer, his eyes fell upon the Daily Prophet on the counter. A weird feeling pulled at his stomach, almost as if he were falling. "Makura Rio," Rio said from the other end of the line, snapping Yugi back to attention. "Rio," Yugi said, "get over here as quickly as possible. I have to talk to you." A day later, 3 children were standing disappointed in front of the Kami game shop. On the door of the dark shop, there was a little note. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, the Kami game shop will be closed for an undetermined period of time. We apologize for the inconvenience. Staff of the Kami game shop."